Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Andrew Samwick, and I'm the director of the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center here at Dartmouth College. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's lecture, Lessons Learned in Ferguson and Implications for the Country, delivered by Reverend Starsky D. The Rockefeller Center is proud to co-sponsor this afternoon's event with the Tucker Foundation as part of Dartmouth's celebrations of Martin Luther King Jr. Those celebrations will continue throughout the weekend and the holiday, including the Community Multi-Faith Celebration on Sunday, January 18th in Rollins Chapel at 3 p.m. Reverend Wilson will be preaching. The Gospel Choir and the World Music Drum Ensemble will be providing musical additions, and there will be a reception in the Hayward Lounge at the Hanover Inn immediately following the service. If you're like me, and I know I'm not alone in this, but I won't speculate as to how big the group is, then the last 6 months have been a gradual and disturbing awakening. Every passing week brings a new moment of disbelief in which I wonder how we possibly could have gotten to this place. From a comfortable perch in the Upper Valley, it appears that the threads in the fabric of our society that purport to uphold justice and equality are unraveling. But as much as I read and think and empathize and grieve, I cannot help but feel very far removed personally from Ferguson, Missouri. But there are others, not very much like me, who know firsthand how we have gotten to this place. They've dedicated themselves to occupying and improving the space that exists between the idealized version of our laws and society and the way that many of our citizens experience the segregation, marginalization, humiliation, and worse from which the law and our civil society fail to provide adequate protection. We are blessed to have such a person with us today in Reverend Starsky Wilson. Reverend Wilson is the pastor of the St. John United Church of Christ in St. Louis, where in the past 6 years he has led congregational activism on issues across the policy spectrum, including youth violence prevention, Medicaid expansion, public school accreditation, voter mobilization, capping payday lending, and raising the minimum wage. In 2011, he was appointed the president and CEO of the Deaconess Foundation, a faith-based grant-making organization devoted to making child well-being a civic priority in the St. Louis region. Through its impact partners, Deaconess Foundation has launched a community capacity-building initiative to strengthen care for children through advocacy, community engagement, and public policy. Reverend Wilson earned a bachelor's degree in political science from Xavier University of Louisiana and a master's of divinity from Eden Theological Seminary. He is currently pursuing the Doctor of Ministry degree in his vast amounts of spare time, I suppose, from Duke University's Divinity School. His community leadership has been honored many times, including by the St. Louis Business Journal, St. Louis Children's Hospital, the Urban League, the YMCA, his alma mater, and many others. Perhaps the biggest honor, and the one most relevant to our discussions today, occurred when Missouri Governor Jay Nixon appointed Reverend Wilson to co-chair the Ferguson Commission. The commission is a group of 16 people who will study the underlying social and economic conditions that have gained attention since the shooting death of Michael Brown Jr. The commission was selected before the grand jury's decision in November, met for the first time in December, and is charged with issuing a report on its findings and making public policy recommendations by September 2015. Looking at the events in Ferguson and elsewhere, there's ample evidence that our nation has not, in Dr. King's words, lived out the true meaning of its creed. The day that he dreamed of is not yet here. Dreaming doesn't make it so. Activists make it so. And more than that, activists in the mold of Dr. King will make it so, whether in formal commissions, from the pulpit, or in the streets. Reverend Wilson is just such an activist, and we are fortunate to have the opportunity to learn from his insights and experiences today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Reverend Starsky Wilson.
I want to thank Andrew very much for that very generous introduction. I want to thank the Rockefeller Center, the Tucker Foundation, the Dartmouth Center for the Advancement of Learning, the Provost and the Dean's Office, all for making possible my visit here. And I also want to thank Rena and hope she's feeling a little better because she kind of, in churchy language, she thought it not robbery to share my name with those who are bringing together this conversation. And I say in a word of warning, you never know who's listening, you never know who's in the crowd. So I come to this space today primarily because I responded to an email offer for help. The email offer for help came because an institution of higher learning in St. Louis, who was to host the Black Lives Matter Freedom Ride over the course of 3 to 4 days for a teach-in, for some organizing and strategy, and for some actions on the ground, decided with 48 hours notice that that was a little too political for them. So they emailed the organizers and said that they didn't think that they could host the event. And so one of my colleagues, and one of those folks who, not a member of my church, but kind of hangs around the church, comes every now and then, likes some of the stuff we're doing in the community, thought that because of the things that we teach and preach, we would be open to such. We were glad to get the email and we opened our doors, so we can't take a whole lot of credit. We didn't organize it. We created space and hospitality to let the voices of the movement speak and to engage, and we've been engaged with them ever since in some way or another. So some folks who came in, those 450 people who organized with 2.5 weeks on a hashtag and a good idea, a freedom ride into St. Louis to visit the sacred ground in Ferguson for many of us, to act, to be in solidarity, to learn, to listen, and to mobilize together. Because I opened my doors there, I find myself here. Quite frankly, all the other work aside, it's because I answered that email that I'm here. I lift them up because right now they are gathering. Many of them and others who have joined them are gathering in Arizona for a multi-day conference over this weekend to talk about how to advance this movement forward. And so I just wanted to lift that up in this moment before we begin because I think it's important for us to affirm the reality of the opportunities we receive and appreciate where they come from and recognize that these kinds of opportunities may come from being available and being responsive to the opportunities God provides to us and the voices of others we do not know. Those things being said, I think it's always appropriate to engage in a little bit of level setting. And so my name is Starsky Wilson. In things that are not as impressive as the things that Andrea said. I'm originally from Dallas, Texas. I grew up in a neighborhood called Oak Cliff. For folks who know the area, I'm one of the few people you'll meet outside of Dallas who actually grew up in the city limits. Most folks say you're from Dallas, they mean Plano or Carrollton or one of the significant suburbs, but I actually grew up in the city in Dallas. I grew up raised by a single mom with 4 other siblings in an urban neighborhood, public schools all my life, and had the benefit and the value of the great diversity of those schools and the structures of talented and gifted programs, magnet programs, specialized programs that were there robustly throughout. In high school, I lost my brother to street violence. Also lost my uncle to street violence. These are things that mobilize me and really inform the work that I do always as I see violence in communities. I grew up thinking that I wanted to be a lawyer so that I could help people in the public policy space, even though I didn't have the language, didn't really want to practice, came to find out somewhere in college, number one, that I was called to ministry, something I really didn't want to do. Like, seriously. I went to school in New Orleans, and it was a fun place. Who really wants to be the preacher on campus in New Orleans? discerned my call to ministry during that time. Also had very wise friends who went to law school to say, look, if you're not going to earn the money in practice, don't do this. Find another way to help people. And so nonprofit administration became that path for me. And ultimately, I came back around and stopped battling with God about the work of ministry as well. And so that's how we find ourselves in this place. I do this work because of that background and because of 3 little boys named Starsky, Dallas, and Mason, and a wife who allows it all to happen named Dr. LaToya Wilson. So we're glad to lift them up. As we begin with this level setting, we note that we begin this conversation, and many maps around the campus have noted this, but the nation is brought to this conversation because of something that happened in the heart of America. The St. Louis region, which finds itself in the midst of the nation's heartland, became the center of a conversation on August 9th and the subsequent days and months because we all were exposed to something. We saw something that we should never see. But quite frankly, you saw something that I had seen before. You saw the body of a young African-American male laying in the middle of the street in his own neighborhood, and you saw his blood. Young people in the neighborhood around Canfield Apartment saw that. They saw it because they walked past it 2 or 3 times. Because when the body lay there for 4.5 hours, you can't just in the regular course of business walk past it 2 or 3 times. And because you would think, even if you saw it the first time, that when you came back out of your house, it would be gone, but it was not. And then people began to take pictures. I made this mistake myself, actually. I didn't take a picture, I captured a picture. I still have it in my phone so that I never forgot the image. The mistake I made was I posted the picture. Quickly, one of my Facebook friends reminded me and let me know, because he had already been in contact with the family. He said, you know, Leslie asked that people not share the picture. So within an hour, I took it down because he shared it with me. But the reality is, whether we're folks who are exposed to this incident by the picture of Michael Brown Jr.'s stepfather holding a cardboard sign that said, "The police just killed my son," on August 9th on Twitter, or whether we saw images that people posted because they didn't know anybody who knew Leslie and she didn't want them posted on Facebook on August 10th. We all were exposed to a traumatic image, and that shocked, quite frankly, it shocked our nation, because those who have lived in bubbles and those who have lived with the comfort and privilege of distance got exposed to it face to face. Maybe you didn't see that. Maybe it was the shock that we got by looking at the heart of our nation when a few days later, her citizens who gathered, some in mourning, not in protest, some to support one another and to see what was going on in their neighborhoods, some who were just trying to walk back and forth to get to their homes from the quick trip that, by the way, because there wasn't a full-service grocery store nearby, kind of became their full-service grocery store. Were tear gassed, were shot with rubber bullets, were met with billy clubs, were met with militarized policing that they paid for with their tax dollars. Some of us are here and we get to this point because we were exposed to what some have called, and I don't know that I wouldn't call, state-sanctioned terror. By allowing a body to lay in the midst of a neighborhood for 4.5 hours, and by imposing upon her own citizens acts of violence that were then shared across the nation on Vine and live stream through Twitter and images on Instagram. And we didn't pay attention. We looked away every time we saw it, and we turned the channel until a couple of CNN reporters in a McDonald's also got treated harshly and pushed away. And then this estate of our society decided, because it had been engaged in the affront, this had to be a daily story. And so internationally, Ferguson for weeks was at the top of the news, even when in some of our local communities, it was the third or fourth story down. Came into contact with one of your faculty here today who was in Germany at the time. And she saw and heard these headlines at the top of the international news in Germany. She knew, perhaps some others didn't, that there's significant German influence here in the heart of America. That in the mid-1800s, fleeing from the oppression in Germany, many came as indentured servants. Some in their teens sent their kids on boats that came up through New Orleans where I went to school, came up the Mississippi, looked out upon the topography of the area around St. Louis in southern Illinois on one side and on St. Louis all the way out to Marthasville, Missouri on the other side, and it reminded them of the German Rhinelands. And so they began to settle in places like North St. Louis City where my church is planted. It was planted there in 1852 by some of those German immigrants in the evangelical strand. They also, in a similar church not far from ours, St. Peter's, planted the Deaconess Mission, the Evangelical Deaconess Society of St. Louis, to bring this mission of caring, of health and human services that they knew from their church traditions here to America. Why am I talking about this? Because those same Germans who populated that community for so long, those working class families that were there into the 1950s and 60s until the race riot of Fairground Park, which happened just cat-a-corner from my church. And that began a decline with the integration of the pool there to allow African Americans to go. It turned to be a few days of rioting, which many pinpoint as part of the decline and the first movement out of that neighborhood to North St. Louis County into places like Ferguson, where those folks now live. It all comes full circle. And I lay all of that out because when Michael Brown Jr., that 18-year-old who found himself in an encounter with the police on that day, and Darren Wilson, that officer, and found himself killed and laid in the middle of the street, we saw also the picture of his mother trying to reach him, to provide, at the very least, identification, solace for herself that this was her son. And we saw police hold her back. Leslie's an interesting story. The activists in Ferguson who are in their late teens, early 20s, tell me that I'm old. And I just got a 40 under 40 award. I thought that was like for doing something, right? They tell me that I'm old. And one of them reminds me that I'm old because I'm Mike Brown's mom's age. Leslie McSpadden is 38 years old. She graduated from Ladue High School, one of the most affluent and best school districts in the St. Louis region. She works at a local grocer who's been very great to her and kind to her and caring. She came there through a desegregation program that allowed her that provides busing between these city and county schools, seeks to integrate those in the county, provide space in those in the city and the magnet schools for white students to come in to make sure there's diversity there as well. But Leslie did not have the occasion to leverage the full benefit of that program at that school because my friend Don, who went there with her, who is now leading government affairs for a major multinational company in working out of Washington, D.C., who was in class with her, who's also African-American, who came because his mom was smart enough to find an apartment complex that she could find a little apartment in within the district, so that he came in as a full student. She came in on DSEG, but they found themselves in different tracks in the same school, even though they both had access to this great district. So Leslie finds herself crying, trying to get to her son, provide some solace, provide some care, and to frame what has happened in her life, being pushed back and held back by police whom she pays with her tax dollars. And in the subsequent days, we see the scenes that you all have seen, and we hear questions raised up. We even saw one, it didn't last very long, we saw one Senate hearing on the militarization of police, where there was powerful questioning from our home state senator. But somehow quickly that issue went away when we were negotiating reforms in the city. We saw responses that included that next Saturday, the governor coming out, calling a press conference at a place, Greater St. Mark Church, which had become a hub of the movement, had become a fallback position so that when people got tear gassed, they had a place nearby that they could go to put Maalox, milk in their eyes, something they learned, by the way, on Twitter from Palestinian activists. What do you do when you get tear gas? The governor showed up, and there in that church he stood with lots of African-American electeds around him, and issued a state of emergency, instituted a curfew, and basically told people to go home. And that night, some of us watched the live stream when people were pushed out of the streets that they pay to maintain by officers, police officers and National Guardsmen that they pay with their tax dollars. And ultimately, because the media was pushed off into an area where they couldn't see what was really going on, we had to follow the right Vine streams and Twitter feeds and live streams to see when and how people were treated that night. And it really hadn't ended. There have been several, there's been another state of emergency since issued by the governor, same governor who appointed the commission on which I serve. There's been significant backdoor negotiation of reforms, most of which didn't happen, quite frankly, to try to get those to happen before the grand jury announcement. And then, of course, you had that announcement itself. The legal process that was opened up, where the St. Louis County prosecutor, whom has never brought charges against an officer for a shooting of an African-American whose father was killed by an African-American in the line of duty because he was a police officer, decided not to directly engage in the work of prosecuting in a grand jury. I wondered why, Andrew. Last summer, I had my first occasion to be seated on a grand jury. I wondered why that happened. Mostly, I wondered why I got kicked off that grand jury after a day. I and the other vocal African-American male who had been seated on that grand jury got kicked off after the first day. Partially because we just asked too many darn questions. Because for those of you who have not been on a grand jury, ultimately what usually happens is you have the officer, the arresting officer will come in, and between the prosecutor and the arresting officer, they tell you what the outline of a crime would be, what the statute suggests, and then they tell you details of why there was an arrest, because the only thing you're really deciding is, was there a crime and should there be a trial? But in this case, the prosecutor decided, no, we won't present a case to see if there was a crime. And there is no arresting officer because the officer is still walking around. What we'll do is we'll just give all the people gathered without legal background all the evidence. We'll just kind of put it in front of them and let them come up with what they come up with. I charge any 12 people in this room to come to the same opinion about a set of data so large without any expert guidance. Why would I tell the story this way? Well, because I'm telling the story at the invitation of a public policy center. Now, I am informed by my own religious perspective. So when I say things like state-sponsored violence and I see someone laying out in the middle of the street, I am reminded that crucifixion in the ancient Near Eastern and Roman culture was an act of terror to inform the behavior of people who saw the person laying there or hanging there. So I am informed by that. I must own that which shapes me. But I am driven by this idea that the authorities that do those things are paid by the people they do them to. Which raises a little concern about this little issue that has come up from the heart of America. This heart of America, a metropolitan area of 2.8 million people, even though we're talking about Ferguson, which only has about 20,000. It's an MSA of 2.8 million people in the St. Louis area, whose demographics reflect quite loosely the demographics of the country, and whose governance and challenges, quite frankly, reflect those that we see in other metropolitan areas as well. So we will talk about the implications for the rest of the country, but I think we've got to begin by talking about our democratic ideals when we suggest that this has public policy implications. One of the democratic ideals that we hold is the process of inclusive democracy. That folks get a voice, folks get a vote, they ought to engage. As a matter of fact, some of the early critique we heard coming out of this community is that the elected officials did not reflect the demographics of the community in Ferguson. And then people began to look at things like voting patterns and said, well, there was only 12% voter turnout in the last election. And on both notes in that community, they were right. What they didn't scratch, and I am about to kind of scratch, in fact, how you get beneath stuff, you got to scratch it a little bit, is that there had also been, just about a year and a half before in this community, the ouster of the first African-American school superintendent by a predominantly white, all white except for one, school board as well, also elected in the same kind of electorate. But when you think about the majority African-American population in Ferguson, you would say, well, why don't they just elect African-Americans to these posts? Well, a couple of things we've got to consider when we talk about inclusive democracy and the implications of fixing things through elective politics. First and foremost, I would suggest we've got to think about when elections happen. Many of our localized elections happen on a cycle that is separate from national elections. We also know that there's higher turnout from African Americans and other minority groups in these national elections, whether it's the primaries or the general election. But in our region, I imagine in many, we end up having weird election cycles where we're electing like the mayor on a ballot by itself in like February, when there's just been a general election in November. Why couldn't we have advanced that by a few months? It gets at whether we really want inclusive democracy. The other thing we've got to be thoughtful about, and some of these, I tried to create a nice linear presentation. It didn't work out like that. Because these are intersectional issues. So I may seem like I'm coming back around to something, but we also must note that civic engagement in a particular community is driven by how long we've been in that community and what our connections are in that community. And so one of the things that we saw in St. Louis County is that over the course of the last 10 years, we've seen an increase of 40,000 people, low income, increase of 40,000 people living below the poverty line in St. Louis County. Many of those folks have been a part of a wave from St. Louis City to St. Louis County. And so you find yourself in a neighborhood that you don't still think about as your neighborhood. So Mayor Knowles, he may be cool, right? He's the mayor of Ferguson, which is a part-time job where he makes about $300 a meeting. But I still think of Francis Slay, the guy from St. Louis, as my mayor, because that's where I grew up. That's where I still go back to go to church. That's where my family roots are. And so I've not shifted to civically engage in a space and a place that is my new residence because I'm still centered on that old place. Now, we can talk about whether that's right or wrong, but I do think we must own that that's one of the issues that's going on as it relates to civic engagement. Now, this other matter about inclusive democracy is a little more troubling. So, and it gets to implications for the country. There are those, and I tend to follow their logic, who make connections between racialized flashpoints in American history that keep cropping up. LA, 1992. New York, 9/11. Katrina. Detroit. Ferguson. He wondered, what's the connection on these? Some are natural disasters, some are Cincinnati, 2001. Some are natural disasters, some are human-made. But the governmental responses to these matters have also been really interesting. In Katrina, we see the militarization of public works such that resources that could be available to all people, that should be available on a social service kind of approach, are actually militarized so that there's a consolidation of authority and how they get handled. Detroit, an emergency manager is placed in a city that's in trouble. And so decisions are made by the consolidation and centralization of authority in a few people who are largely corporatized folks and not necessarily folks who live in or who are of a community. Let's try another one. Public education, special administrative or appointed school boards, in places where there have previously been elected school boards. All of these smack of situations where democracy is actually being undermined and is not representative of the communities that are served, and largely to protect against minorities in these communities. Why would you do that? There are those who would lift this, and perhaps I shouldn't, but I will, that when you see an election like 2008 or another like 2012, and you know that the demographics suggest that the majority of the country will actually be people of color, and that perhaps elections where there's high turnout won't go the way that you would have had them to go, then you begin to centralize authority rather than democratizing voice. And what we saw in Ferguson is what you need in order to make that work. What you need in order to make that work is a high-power, high-caliber police force to protect authority from the very people who have made it possible. That sounds kind of conspiracy theory-esque. But maybe not. Perhaps this is the wider, the more significant conversation we should be having. Perhaps this is the conversation in a broad frame that allows us to see police as people who are actually being used as tools by those who would consolidate authority and seek to be protected from people whom they should be accountable to. Perhaps this allows us to not see a conflict between people of color and police on a front line without being thoughtful about the infrastructure and the context in which it happens. Because they're both, quite frankly, hands, palms, engaged in the wider work. And maybe this helps us get to the kinds of reconciliation and affirmation of people's perspective and humanity that is required to move beyond these points. Because the people in the pictures on the front line, whether they are activists who are expressing their pain, or whether they are police who are just standing there doing their job, ultimately support systems that make them either tools or victims. And this is a public policy conversation. Will we actually engage in a project of inclusive democracy, and will we trust that when we listen to and engage the most people, we will actually get the best product, the best policy, the best programs? This is the question. It's a question that's come up all throughout this narrative. It's a question that comes up in the public education conversation where, by the way, Michael Brown graduated from the Normandy High School. Normandy, a school district that was dismantled because it was unaccredited and still doesn't have an accreditation status, and now has an appointed school board. A school where students were told, because your school is not accredited, we will come up with an option where you can go to other schools, and these other schools, your district has to pay $10,000 a head, even though it costs $8,000 a head to educate people in those districts, those predominantly white districts, where there have been gatherings and forums where white members of those communities yell and scream and tell you to go back, and they don't want you. That's the school district he graduated from just months before. And now it's been put back together called the Normandy Collaborative, and they have a fully appointed school board. But maybe, inclusive democracy is okay unless that predominantly black community that would have elected that school board gets to elect people. Or the predominantly black community that would elect the school board in St. Louis Public Schools, which also has a special administrative board, unless they get to elect people. It works until they get it. There are public policy implications in the conversation about public education. It's a broader question of inclusive democracy. I just want to lay out a couple more, and then we'll open up to the conversation. This Heart of America kind of piece that we're dealing with also deals with how we engage philanthropically. So the world in which I live is philanthropy. And one of the things you should know about the St. Louis region is that the philanthropic kind of landscape is based on services, not systems. What do I mean? One of the things I was discussing with Andrew is the role that philanthropy continues to play and increasingly plays in public policy because this great elective system that we believe so much in hadn't produced much in like the last 20 years, particularly because, I don't know, the guys who sit over here and the guys who sit over there, even on times like the State of the Union, they can't sit together. We'll see that tomorrow night or in a few nights, right? We can't even sit together. We refuse to clap for a point that may not be consistent with exactly how we would have said it. And so other sectors, including philanthropy, is advancing public policy and advancing these conversations. But when you find a community like St. Louis, and I would suggest you find this across the nation as well, except for the very elite of our philanthropies, we see people wanting to invest in services, not systems. And so they want to make sure Michael Brown has a mentor. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing that Michael Brown has a mentor. But how about we fix the educational system that Michael Brown came out of and make sure it has money? They want to make sure that Michael Brown has access to a boys or girls club, but don't want to make sure that a policeman that shoots him actually has to stand before an independent body. We're focused on services and not systems. And so the responses that we saw were very consistent with that. So we saw people invest very early on in mental health services for young people. We saw people invest very early on a drop-in center to make sure that people who had immediate needs, who had been, by the way, locked and blocked into their neighborhood by the police, who put cement barriers down at the back of the Canfield apartments, who were checking people's ID at the front door. I'm sorry, just checking the black folks' ID at the front door of their own neighborhood. Because this diverse, let's correct the narrative, this diverse apartment complex that was made up of market rate housing, not the hood, was also populated by white and black residents. But the black ones were the ones who said that the police wouldn't let them in their neighborhood if they didn't have proper ID. So they had to go around the barricades in the back. And they're still worn out areas in the grass where people had to take their cars to get to their own homes. So they invested in supports and services to make sure those people got their utility bills paid if they lost their jobs because they couldn't get to work, because they couldn't get out of their neighborhoods, or because their kids' schools were shut down, and because they didn't have the resources to just kind of hire somebody for a week to take care of their kids, so they had to stay home with them. We invest in those kind of services, but we refuse to invest in policies, systems, advocacy, community organizing that would actually transform the structures that oppress people. We choose services over systems all the time. We do it in our churches every time we want to collect for the food pantry, but refuse to go out and make sure that low-income people have a ride to the polls. This is where we live in the heart of America. This is more than just its heartbeat. This is not just the geography that we speak of here, but it's also the reality across the nation. Dropping just a couple of these. I mean, for the sake of not walking back and forth, I'm just going to hold this for a second. And I am almost done so we can get into some questions. I just want to make sure I don't miss a couple of things here. As we talk about this from a public policy situation, we must also think about significant shifts. I talked about it before, but I'll come back to it now. Significant shifts in poverty trends. So you see increasing work, a new work by a woman by the name of Elizabeth Kneebone on confronting suburban poverty. So I told you the statistics on the growth of poverty in St. Louis County, but the implications of that are this. When you have philanthropy that is aligned, national philanthropy tends to align significantly with cities, with the urban core, and with national initiatives. So you hear programs being announced where even federal dollars with social impact bonds and the like are connected to partnerships with the U.S. Conference of Mayors or the National League of Cities. That's great, that's fine, except that it's uniquely selective to cities. And so a place like Ferguson, where you see significant growth in poverty rates, would not have access to those same kind of resources. Our philanthropy follows. And so the areas that have the greatest need now and the emerging need as it relates to social services and supports lack the social services because there's not the philanthropic investment to build the capacity in those areas. And so these things become challenges for us as well because we can't exactly keep up with where poverty has moved. So it may very well be the case that our cities are over-infrastructured to care for poverty today, and our suburbs are under-infrastructured to care for poverty. And now I just have to tell a quick narrative about American embarrassment. And I'm assuming something as I do it. So if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. It'll be on YouTube and the world, and we'll know that I'm wrong. This is something I found interesting. We had this great conversation about American policing going on. So much so that an assistant professor at St. Louis University Law School put together a group of folks representing the Organization for Black Struggle, Hands Up United, and the Don't Shoot Coalition in St. Louis, which had formed the most significant resistance in the days after the Michael Brown shooting and continues to form such today. And so he used his legal mind resources and the like to put together a group to go to the United Nations Conference on Torture. And there, young activists from St. Louis, from Ferguson and the community joined with activists from the Black Youth Project 100 out of Chicago and presented to the nation, to the world at the United Nations, atrocities of police brutality in the United States of America. And the report from that conference came out on a Friday. I started getting text messages and phone calls that Friday. We had already had the announcement of the commission, the Ferguson Commission. We were set to have our first meeting on December 1st. But two young commissioners, Rasheen Aldridge and Brittany Packnett, were conflicted because they got calls to come to the White House on Monday for some meetings. They didn't have kind of the full agenda for, but they knew it was something organized by the Department of Justice, and it was the White House. And so they're trying to figure out if they could go later, what time was the meeting. They didn't know what time the meeting was. They knew a couple of things. Number one, they were social media embargoed from the point that they got the call. Number two, they were going to a meeting that was about policing. And so they went, and there in a full day of announcements with a lot of leading folks from across the community in the nation, and some folks, some young activists in this White House meeting as well. There was announced on Monday a new task force on 21st century policing in the U.S. after the Friday release of the United Nations report rebuking the United States for its policing practices. Guess what got covered that week? And I just say this to say we have to be thoughtful about these responses, particularly these responses that include stuff like commissions. With that, I'll close my remarks on some reflections. Reflections on resistance, response, and reconciliation. When I talk about commissions, I say we got to be careful for a couple of reasons. Number one, for those who want to kind of get into this study, because I am kind of a nerd about stuff that I do, the definitive work on commissions in America is entitled Flack Catchers. Published in 2010. It's on 100 years of riot commissions in the United States of America. The 21st Century Policing Task Force and Commission appointed by the president is set to release its findings somewhere like in March. So it's got about 90 days to work. Similar to the McCone Commission in California, it worked for 90 days, spent $250,000, $1.8 million in today's dollars, to come up with solutions. Largely getting the same critique that we got when they announced the commission. The governor announced the commission in October, appointed the commission in November. Aren't they going to study stuff that we already know? Aren't they just going to produce a report that's going to sit on the shelf? That's largely the history. Yes, it is. We must own that up front. It is a way to put a line, I found out on December 1st. For many, it is a way to put a line of defense between responsible electeds and the communities that they should be accountable to. We should own that. I found that out in tragic circumstance in hour number 4 of a 6.5 hour meeting when the people got tired of listening to us and decided it was time for them to talk. This response of commissions that have responsibility articulated to research these issues. And for us, you should know, and if you want more information, go to stlpositivechange.org. There you can find Executive Order 1415, where Governor Jeremiah Nixon signed into existence the Ferguson Commission. And our work, dedicated work, was to study the issues that led to the shooting on August 9th, and there have been the social and economic conditions that have been exposed since, to issue a report by September 15th, focusing on a couple of areas of work: citizen law enforcement relations, municipal courts and municipal organization, and race and ethnic relations. And then a long list of about 9 disparities that are social determinants of health: education, economic opportunity, housing, transportation, family stability. Just if you can think of one, it's probably in there. Study these things, issue a report September 15. One of the things that we've decided to do is to try to tweak the model a little bit. And I should say, in the connection between resistance, research, and reconciliation, this was kind of a tough space for me. It was a tough space for me because I had spent more time at that point with activists. Our foundation had already invested $100,000 in youth organizing, saying what we see in these indigenously led groups out here that are creating this resistance, that's what actually gives us hope. So we're going to put funding into that. We're not going to fund the economic development, the rebuilding of small businesses on West Florissant. The corporate people will take care of that. We're not going to fund summer jobs for kids because Lord knows after the next summer, most of that funding is going to be gone again. So we're going to invest in resistance. And so that's what we did from our foundation. We not only invested in resistance, we convened a 2-day meeting of national foundations working with the Executives Alliance for Expanding Opportunities for Boys and Young Men of Color, Neighborhood Funders Group, and others convened these tables to invite national funders who actually do fund organizing and advocacy, even though our local funders don't, to come in to see what they can invest in to support this movement, because that's where we were really going to get change. So we did that. And then with my clergy hat on, I hung out a lot on the front lines at night with folks who found themselves arrested for doing things like being too loud. One October morning, I go and open my laptop computer and there's a call for clergy to go down to the St. Ann Police Department. The St. Ann Police Department is where people who were in Ferguson got taken. It's a neighboring suburb because Ferguson was building a fresh new jail. And so they couldn't put people in there. So they sent people to St. Ann. So I was called out for clergy to come and hold vigil at the St. Ann jail because 13 protesters had been arrested that night in the rain, on the sidewalk, for yelling too loud. Violation of a noise ordinance that in your neighborhood or in your suburb, you would get a $150 ticket in the mail for. They got arrested and had bonds as high as $2,700 for one of them. Once we totaled up the bonds to try to get them out that day, we recognized the total bonds was up in the area of $30,000 for all 13 of them. Excessive. Somebody held up the new Jim Crow earlier today. So we begin to see how systems link minor crimes, criminalize people, try to keep them in jail. We heard about that day from actually a very supportive and helpful chief of police, a system called a 24-hour hold, where they had the right to just grab somebody off the street and just keep them in jail without any charges for 24 hours. And that's what they had done to these young protesters. And so I had spent more time with them. We spent all day that day trying to get them out of jail. It's pretty hard because most of the legal community was gathered together to see one of our own in the state legal officials to be elevated, and his investiture was that day to become a federal judge. So everybody was there together, couldn't get a judge on the phone, couldn't get a black lawyer from nowhere, so we had a tough time that day. We finally got them out of jail, and we began to seek to support them by being present with them on the front lines at night, to stand beside them, behind them, to pray for them, and in front of them when they stood face to face with police. And because I'd spent so much time with them, it was kind of hard to decide that it was going to be time to roll with the governor on the commission. And so we decided that the only way we could really do this was to make sure that the work of reconciliation that the commission was called to do, that the work of research that this commission was called to do, had to be aligned with the work of resistance that was happening in the streets. That we could not start with the work of intellectuals and academics from universities. We had to start with the voices of the people. We couldn't just be a riot commission. We had to be one part truth commission, one part riot commission, one part public policy think tank. And it all had to happen in the public. And so one of the ways we're seeking to get around being just another report on the shelf is to listen deeply to people, to lean in with our listening ears, and to make sure that everything we do is sustainable because it's responsive to the agitation on the ground, to continue to support and educate people to engage in the activism on the ground. So we have since deployed additional resources, secured more grant money to invest in community organizing, particularly youth organizing around these issues of police reform in our community. My foundation is still doing that work while we do this work. And to make sure all the meetings are open and public, and that everyone who's out there who has a list of demands has a platform to get that list of demands in front of the commission, and to make sure that it comes through a process that is sunshineable so that we are accountable for the information that we received and what we did with it. And so the continuum from resistance to reconciliation that leads through these commissions has to be transformed, and that's the project that we're working on right now. And because I've talked so long, and because I'll get more opportunities to talk throughout the weekend, now I'll just say thank you again for listening and invite any questions on the things that we've shared. So I see there's at least one microphone here, and there are a couple of microphones, one on each aisle. So open to questions and thoughts and reflections.
Actually, if this is on, I'm seeking advice. I've heard more often than I can count that we, and I think that we as people like me and you, or focusing on race and referring to Michael Brown or Trayvon Martin, and it has little to do with race and more to do with the training of police. Do you have any suggestions on how I respond to that in a peaceful manner?
Pray a lot. So I think, first of all, don't give up the ground, but find the intersection. This is about race and policing. Clearly, it is about both. It is about insufficient racial profiling laws, including the one in Missouri. It is about insufficient police training. Police training in the state of Missouri is overseen by the Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission. The Director of Public Policy is ultimately responsible for that. In your particular states, you will likely find that there is some cabinet level official reporting to the governor who has authority for such. And so what we found out, and I invite you to investigate this in your particular context, is that police training, continuing education for police in our state at a top level police department or community like ours only requires 48 hours of continuing education every 3 years. Police officers are not required to have bachelor's degrees, but rather 64 hours of community college or an associate's degree. Now, a couple of things that go together there. And then the other thing is that in their 48 hours, they're not required to do use of force training or racial profiling training. So the quality and the quantity of police training definitely needs to increase throughout the country for all of us. So before I get to the race issue, for someone who deals with trauma, the trauma of the loss of life and violence on a daily basis, you do not want a 10-year officer to have had their last experience of training in the use of force in the academy. Because you got to engage in some muscle memory here, right? So if you're put in a tragic situation, you're either going to go to what you were trained because you know it so well and you can run through those processes, or you're going to go to the natural human thing, which is fear. And when you have a racialized perspective, which many of us, probably most of us, not a racist, but a racialized perspective of the other, then when they come at you at night, and it's a situation where you may be in harm, then you will default to your fear, and you have the capacity to use fatal force. So it is both a race issue and a police training issue. And part of it has to do with representation of minorities in police forces. It has to do with racial profiling training and whether that is mandated, whether use of force training is mandated. And quite frankly, and this is one of the points that came up from that UN delegation when they presented to our commission, whether regular psychological evaluation is mandated. Because Lord knows, I mean, clergy in the room tell you, just listening to folk problems on a regular basis will cause you to have to sit down somewhere and talk to somebody. I'm serious about that, right? And when you need that, you need to go get it. So just imagine dealing with the kinds of tragedies that our officers have to see face to face, day after day, in long hours, away from their families. To not check in every now and then to make sure that they're okay, to not have that mandated and supported in the law, is a disservice to them and to the public that they're called to serve. So yes, it's deeply about police training, but it is also deeply about race. One over here. A couple hands.
I'll need the mic. Thank you for the talk.
They're recording.
Okay, I'm sorry.
If the world gonna know what I said, they got to know what you said too.
Thank you for the talk. I want to know, what do you tell to millennials who, on one hand, are inspired and encouraged by the activism and the mobilizing that we've seen in Ferguson and in New York and around the world, but also those that are extremely discouraged and disheartened and depressed by a legacy and tradition that tells us that things aren't going to change and that we've learned in school that a system that's not designed to protect us. What do you say to us?
Yeah. I say continue to think critically about these realities, and it's good to affirm You said something very important that I just want to lift up. There are people who argue that the system is broken. But there are millennials like you who say, nope, the system is fixed. It's working exactly how it was designed to work. Okay? It's not designed to protect us. And so what I say in that moment is, there's unfinished work to do, and that's your work. And you don't have to do it like anyone else has done it before, but you got to take up the work for the sake of living. Because you got a couple of options. I mean, before this moment, folks looked at millennials and said, oh, they don't care about anything, and da-da-da. They were really talking about us, quite frankly, the ones who came before you. They don't care about anything. They're self-absorbed. That was really us, seriously. But I say that to say, in order to keep hope in your own life, you got to work in the struggle and believe that it can get better. It's easy to check out and default and say, particularly in the first generation that's not going to do as well as its parents. Right? You got to fight. You got to get up every morning like music over people. My friend Alexis on Twitter said, let's go get free. And know that until you are satisfied with your degree of freedom, and your degree of freedom is tied to people who don't look like you, who are being oppressed in other places, then you'll not be free. And until you're satisfied with your degree of freedom, then you ought to be fighting. And you ought to find a way and a space to fight. For some people, that space is the academy. Now, I'm quick to say, I've said this in other settings, so I keep saying it. If y'all have been with me in other settings, I'll say this. We don't do allies no more. Ain't no more allies. Ain't no more. Because this is not a black movement. This is not a millennial movement. This is a movement, if you look closely through the tear gas, you will see black, white, Hispanic, Latino. You'll see Palestinians, Jewish, young, old, able-bodied, developmentally disabled, literally, out on the streets. There's some sisters out there in wheelchairs live streaming. There's room for you. So there's no need to be an ally and stand outside. Either you in or you out. So once you decide whether you're in or you're out, then you decide, what does in mean? Maybe in means writing. Don't jump quickly to that. Just say, assess your degree of privilege and access, and then determine what your space is. So I say, keep fighting, like seriously. And you got to have hope that things get better. Don't have hope in the system. Have hope in your own capacity to make things better by pressuring the system. I said to a group of clergy gathered, I was blessed to be a part of an annual retreat that Jim Wallace from Sojourners brought to Ferguson, and working with a group of faith leaders from across the country. We were in a panel session. And this always happens, and I hope they don't see this on YouTube. But, respectable black leaders that are a little older than me always ask, so how's the work on voter registration and education and mobilization going? Or do these young people know that they need to get out and vote? I said, they know that system real well. They also know that nobody was paying attention to them until they got in the street. So there may be time for that, but until you start seeing reform, stay in the street. Because you need to pressure a system that's not working for you to make change before you put your trust in that system. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
My question was just to ask if you can give some more detail about the commission's report, how you're going to help it not just sit on a shelf and have policy change, for example, take place through what you report.
Yeah. Thank you. Great question. A couple of things. Number one, we think that this is a process where we have the opportunity to document the concerns and challenges of people. So every commission meeting includes open mic space. It includes some framing from electeds or officials who are responsible for the particular issue. So a case in point, the meeting that we had that was focused on citizen law enforcement relations, we had the Director of Public Safety to talk about the post-commission so that people could see where some of the levers were that they could continue to push. And then we engaged in breakout sessions. So if it was all the folks in this room, We would have some folks go into a facilitated session where you would talk about and document your issues around use of force training. Others would talk about racial profiling, and others would have an opportunity to talk about police and community relations. Document that, and to put it up on the website, make it fully available to everyone so that we're having an ongoing discussion. So some of that's truth, showing back that we're actually listening. The reason why we do that is because we believe the most sustainable thing we can do in making these policy recommendations is to make sure that they are aligned with people and that we build enough trust along the way with people who will keep pressure on the system until it produces the kinds of policy change that they have asked for. So some of that is throughout the process saying to the 900 people who have been in our 4 meetings so far, reporting back to them every time we have a meeting, saying this is what has happened so that they build enough trust. We feed that information to our work groups. They come back with recommendations that are consistent there. And then we give that back, not just to the governor. And I said this on the day of the announcement. We are appointed by the governor. The agenda is set by the commissioners, but we are accountable to the people. And so we're giving a report back to the people. And that's the only thing that's going to make it sustainable, and it has to be aligned there. The other thing that we've been thoughtful to do is to begin to look and speak already with philanthropic sources who may be interested in implementation and translation. To talk about what does it look like, what needs to be the leave behind, such that there is sustained engagement around these issues once the commission has submitted its report. We're still, I mean, that's a growing edge, quite frankly. We see in Cincinnati, there was a group called Better Together Cincinnati that was built and left behind after the Cincinnati Community Action Now engagements and commission. That becomes a bit of a model for us, but we'll need to continue to do that. And then finally, not waiting until the report's done to act. So we've made commitments that once we've fully kind of legislated or processed an issue, we'll make recommendations on an interim basis. One case in point is that when we studied municipal court reform, we heard people talking about all these issues. And so you should know, I talk about municipal fragmentation a little bit. We have kind of 3 cogs that work in our community. You've got police and community relations here, small cog. You have the municipal courts, and you have municipal fragmentation as an issue, or municipal governance. Because we have 91 municipalities in one county, we have a lot of redundancy, and we have a lot of need for dollars to feed this system. Guess how it gets fed? Through municipal courts, through the issuance of tickets, through the stacking up of warrants, in a system where judges can be judges in 3 different municipal courts on a part-time basis, be a prosecutor in another one. So you can see some of the same people, right? But the real problem is that this municipal governance and the inefficiencies there create a need for resources that the courts fill, and then it impacts policing because there are negative interactions with the police. They don't have time to go do DARE programs and police athletic leagues because they got to write enough tickets to feed this beast. So it impacts the work that police get to do in our community as well. This may not be everywhere, but I'm informed by work like Mapping Decline by Colin Gordon and Fragmentation by Design by Terry Jones to suggest that we may not be alone in this. We may not be as unique as we think we are. What do I mean? So finally, to get to your question, when we saw this system, we began to look at the law. And the law said that in the state of Missouri, a municipality should not bring in more than 30% of its revenue from tickets. And we found that there were at least 13 municipalities in St. Louis County that were either bringing in more than 30%, or they refused to report, or they filed a report that said they were giving less than 30%, but when you look at the report, it looked like they actually were giving more, and getting more from tickets. And so we engaged directly with the authorities. We raised the question in our meetings about who's responsible here, and finally engaged in long-term conversations with the Attorney General until he came out to file suit against those 13 municipalities. And so that's the kind of engagement, negotiation that we'll continue to do, and that's before a report gets issued. But because we are a third body, you know what I mean, independent group, independent third party in these conversations, then we can shine a light on situations, call for action, and then stand with those who act. So we were pleased that the Attorney General acted, so my co-chair and I stood with him when he took the action. And we've taken flack from that too. But that's the kind of work that has to be done. So. And back here. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak about the Tamir Rice case and if there's connection and collaboration with the folks in Cleveland and what you think will happen with any grand jury. And it's a long list of questions, but if what your opinion is on grand juries in general.
Yeah. I think Tamir Rice is just a tragedy. It becomes more tragic with every detail that we find, including, but most significantly, when we continue to find inconsistencies in police detail, like what we found out recently about his sister, who was handled when she was trying to get to him, and we got a different narrative on that before as well. This is one of the reasons why accountability is important, and we need systems of accountability. Now, I don't know if this is going to come out of our commission, but I'm going to keep pushing for it. I think independent citizen review with subpoena power and authority is required, at least in cases when there's fatal use of force. That we cannot depend on prosecutors who work with police all the time to send criminals to jail to investigate those same police. I think, so from a grand jury standpoint, you know, I'm informed by the fact that I sat in a room full of activists watching the movie Selma on a private screening. And while I was sitting there with those people who were still organizing and activated around Michael Brown, we got the news that there was a no true bill about Eric Garner in New York. So I don't have a whole lot of hope for what's coming out of Cleveland's grand jury. What I will say is that it is another instance where we must connect the dots and say that if nothing else, we've got to get transparency here. And quite frankly, to this racialized issue, it's another instance of the fact that we have criminalized black bodies. I mean, I know y'all are all sophisticated, you know, well-developed and refined individuals. But somebody in here played with a gun. Cowboys and Indians, G.I. Joe. You telling me we can't do that? Black kids can't do that in the park anymore? A public space? A fake gun, which, by the way, the 911 report suggested that it was probably fake when you listen to what the person who called it in. Not all that inconsistent with John Crawford. It's not real. Famous last words. Because we have, I'm sorry, we have done this. We have criminalized youth and we have criminalized black bodies. And if you believe the Department of Justice, you got all kinds of issues in the Cleveland Police Department from public reports that have to be reformed. And if it takes, I mean, this is the deal. If it takes the Department of Justice to get from your police department what you should have been getting all the time, then we have a problem with fragmented policing in this country that needs to be reformed. So, I connect the dots. This gentleman in the center has a question.
So I noticed a lot of what you've been talking about has been activism targeted at municipal governments, smaller, closer, but sometimes much more staunchly against those people, it seems. How would you suggest activists change their strategies for those closer but sometimes harder opportunities to influence the systems there, when to move outside of that system?
Yeah, when you say smaller, I want you to describe a little bit for me what kind of systems you mean.
Oh, meaning like a town versus like the state, as in like just more local. Sorry, that was kind of garbled question.
No. It's good. I think the lesson of this weekend, as we reflect on the legacy of Dr. King, right, is that you don't get a national movement until you win locally. Right? I'm glad they localized on Selma. For a long time, until the movie came out, then you had to kind of begin to make the parallels that go with where the popular rhetoric is. We were talking about, in philanthropic circles, we kept talking about Ferguson as Montgomery. It's probably more consistent, more appropriate parallel. that you need sustained action over a significant period of time in Montgomery's 381 days to win. And the challenge is the wins here are more difficult. There was kind of a clean, this is what we're trying to do, this issue, this system. But you need multiple kind of policy changes here that will not necessarily illustrate an immediate impact. People won't be able to go sit on the bus and all of a sudden we win, we feel it, right? There'll be a system of police review in place that hopefully you never have to use. There'll be systems of accountability. So there won't be the same kind of exhilaration or delight from that win. But I think you're right. And I think protesters are doing this. That people came to Ferguson and some marvelous things happened. People came to Ferguson to illustrate solidarity and to train and to organize together. They developed a model and a blueprint for actions that moved just beyond the Occupy movement. So you see new tactics being added to social activism. So you went from Occupy to shutting stuff down in a different way. So it means different to occupy something and shut something down. And so I think you saw that kind of exchange, but then people took it back to local realities, and it wasn't just about Ferguson, but it was about what's going on in our community, right? So it was about Staten Island. It was about Beaver Creek. And you've seen these interconnections. So we've seen the Millennial Activists United and Hands Up United exchanging with Ohio Student Association and going and being in solidarity there. And what they don't like to do, they can't stand this. Some activists came back from Milwaukee and they were upset because they were in Milwaukee and people in Milwaukee were handing them the megaphone. They're like, I shouldn't lead actions about Dontre Hamilton, another name that we forget. I shouldn't be leading actions about Dontre Hamilton. Folk in Milwaukee ought to be leading actions about Dontre Hamilton, right? So it's very much localized. I think people are clearly cutting issues, and I think that must happen in order to build a sustained movement for the kinds of change we require in our systems of policing, and to advance, again, the wider frame for me, to advance inclusive democracy in this nation for the next few generations. Because I think that's ultimately what's at stake, and police are a tool in it. Another question? There's a gentleman here.
Can't say I disagree with anything I've heard you say so far, and in particular, all politics is local. So, since politics really is not going to go away, what do you say to the millennials? Because I have heard a young black leader from this school, who I think very, very highly of, say, you can't trust Republicans or Democrats, don't bother voting. Which, that to me is walking away from the problem. And I also am hopeful, I don't know when it's happening, in my generation or the next, that voters will be more than 50% non-white. So don't give up on the power of the ballot box. I think needs to be re-emphasized to millennials and after millennials.
Yeah, I think it begins though, not with voting, but with holding those who are elected accountable. I said to someone this morning, I really appreciated the opportunity to speak with them, and these different settings are helping me to refine some thoughts. It struck me that you're the first primary in the nation. Because someone asked me last night, I forget who it was, at base camp, they asked me, which you should go to base camp if you haven't been there, just a little plug, it's great. Great food. They asked me, do you think this will be an issue in the presidential election? And finally it took me overnight, but I said, you know what? It will only be an issue in the presidential election if you all make it one. Democrats aren't going to raise this issue, neither are Republicans. They don't want to talk about it. The president was forced into talking about it, and he didn't have to run for election again, ever. Ever. So I think it does begin with holding the systems accountable, and when you begin to see reforms from the system, then you engage it more. It's the same thing with us at the commission, right? We couldn't just ask people to come out and share, be honest with us, open with us, risk on camera. When police have started to take cameras out to the protest line and hold them up so that they have faces, we couldn't ask people to tell their truth on camera until we illustrated that they could trust us. And so I say to those millennials to engage a few electeds, hold them accountable, engage in relationship with them so that you can see how they act and how they react, and then see what happens and engage in that process, or see whether it is still required for you to hold that process more accountable through acts of resistance. I also say, I learned this term from Bill Clinton. He was talking about fundraising and his capacity to fundraise versus one of his Republican opponents' capacity to fundraise. And the Republican was saying, you're talking about all this campaign finance reform, but you keep raising all this money in these other ways. How about we come to a truce on this thing and we just use government funding? He said, I'm not going to unilaterally disarm, right? While I'm beating you, especially now while I'm beating you, right? So my suggestion is, yes, engage in the process, but don't unilaterally disarm. Continue to engage in acts of resistance to hold people accountable, even those you know. If Starsky is leading the commission and Starsky's not doing what Starsky told you to do, shut the meeting down. Shut it down. Because he's not being true to what he told you he was going to do. And that's with anybody else. And I say to you, New Hampshire, we're counting on you to make sure this makes it into the presidential conversation in 2016, when people who maybe they've already been here, if not, they'll be here next month. You know it, right? 16 election, it's 2015, it's time for them to make it to New Hampshire. When they come knocking on your door next month, ask them about police accountability and violence. Because if you ask them, they'll have to talk about it. They might not talk about it in Iowa. Y'all might ask them, though, and they will have to talk about it. They will have to be on the record about it, and that will make it an issue where we will get action. So I invite you all to do that. Yes, sir.
Do you think there's a role for the church and religious communities in bringing about a different kind of relationship between the institutions, the police, and the citizens?
I absolutely believe that. That has informed my work, and it's going to be a difficult continuum. I believe that there are roles for the church based upon our respective theologies, based upon our perspectives on social engagement, social justice, and reform. I mean, you got church like mine. We are a Holy Week, Jesus goes into the temple and turns over the table kind of church. Right? Block up the space where people are being oppressed so that for that moment they cannot be oppressed. That's my church. That ain't everybody's church. Right? There are other churches who, after there can be no exploitation in the temple because the tables are turned over, they invite those who have been hurt, the children, the broken, and the disturbed to themselves so that they can be healed. That's another role for the church. How do you support and engage in the healing process with people who have been harmed by the systems of injustice? Now, everybody's church is not a Jesus church, though. Somebody goes to a Pauline church. Paul says, and maybe we misinterpret sometimes, but the authorities of this world are ordained by God. And so the role is to pray for, affirm, and support the authorities. Those are different roles. On a continuum, I would suggest from resistance to reconciliation. But at the very least, if this is happening and you are a person of faith right now and you know what's going on, you have a role to play. It will require some faithful discernment. The most difficult thing that happened last week, I was out of town again, but on Monday night, a group of clergy that we've been moving with, both in actions and in peaceful pastoral presence, gathered together to have another conversation about what we should be doing. Because we came together, we said, well, maybe we should be standing with the protesters, maybe we should be praying with police. We've done both of those. Maybe we should be using our access to systems to call politicians to account. We've been doing some of that. And some folks said, well, we feel like we should be doing something, but we don't want to be in disruptive actions. So we're just going to have actions that are just faith community people doing silent marches. There's room for all of that. And the question is, what is your theology? What's the foundational theology that drives you? How does it fit into the framework of the work on a continuum? And how can you access that? But this is why I say the church has a role. Every church has a role. Because one thing, no matter where we are, throughout the continuum of Christianity, we believe in a fundamental concept of creation, that humanity is made in the image and likeness of God. That's good Genesis chapter 2 kind of stuff. We don't argue. Now, we argue about Paul and we argue about Jesus. We tend not to argue about the creation. And I tell people a lot that the hashtag that says Black Lives Matter is an affirmation of the Imago Dei. That the image and likeness of God is at stake when people can be cut down anytime there is a loss of life. Where there is 2 officers in New York or 2 boys holding fake guns in Ohio, that when we can cut that down and not move, when the church cannot move, or when the church falls into a position of rebuking people who are responding to the pain of the loss of life, then they've been less than faithful to something that's central to all of us, that humanity is a reflection of God. And when it is cut off, the church is called to action.